Hey everyone, it's Alexander Robinson. Welcome to the channel and welcome back to my retro review series on the Scream sequels. We're at the last part before Scream 6 comes out next week, in fact, and today I'm talking about Scream 4, which came out in 2011. Obviously the fourth film in the Scream franchise, and Wes Craven's final film before he passed away in 2015. And I gotta say, right off the bat, this was a good way for him to go out. This being his last movie is sort of a perfect capper to his legacy as a director, even if he's made some terrible movies. Let's not ignore the misfires in his career, but this was a nice way to go out. The movie takes place about 15 years after the events of the Woodsboro murders. The fictional Stab series has now lasted for 7 movies. However, they no longer use the Sidney Prescott character, and from this point on, they've just been doing their own things. So, sequels just for the sake of making sequels. But anyway, Sidney, played by Neve Campbell once again, returns to Woodsboro and is on a book tour. She's written a book about her experiences of the Woodsboro murders. And the timing couldn't have been any worse, because just as this happens on the 15th anniversary of the Woodsboro murders, and just as Sidney has returned to town, murders start happening by somebody wearing a ghost face mask. So Sidney is once again involved in this scenario, along with Dewey, who is now sheriff of Woodsboro, and his wife Gail, played again by David Arquette and Courteney Cox respectively. And they're also accompanied by a new cast of characters who are well-versed horror fans themselves. This movie came out just a year before I started reviewing movies on YouTube, back on my old channel, and I was always interested to see this one. For some reason, I always disregarded the other Scream sequels, but heard really good word of mouth on this one. So this was the Scream sequel I was the most excited to see for this series of reviews. And I gotta say, it doesn't disappoint. It was very much a return to form for the Scream franchise, because Scream 3, I am still not on board with it. It's got a lot of good ideas, and it's not terrible. It's not an unwatchable movie, but it's such a colossal misfire with so many stupid situations that happen throughout. This movie is again a return to form. It's once again written by Kevin Williamson, and it came out at probably the most appropriate time. As we all know, the 2000s was mostly a decade of horror remakes, but also torture porn, because the Saw franchise had just kicked into high gear and was turning out a movie every October. So for this movie to come out just a year after the Saw franchise ended, and after the Nightmare on Elm Street remake kind of killed the remake trend, it was the perfect time to do it, because each Scream movie definitely had something that they wanted to say in terms of horror or film in general. The first movie was very self-aware when it came to the rules of horror movies. The second one talked about how to make a proper follow-up, make it bigger and grander. Maybe not better, but that's debatable. Scream 3 was all about how to close out a trilogy, which was pretty rare for the horror genre. So this movie has a reason to exist. It's not just, hey, let's make another Scream movie just for the sake of it. It was made to comment on the trend of horror remakes and torture porn, because a lot of the same scenarios from the first Scream happen in this one. Not to a T, but it definitely has that feeling of, we've seen this before, and that's intentional. And in terms of the torture porn commentary, the kills in this movie are far more brutal than in Scream 3. Now, apparently the reason a lot of the kills in Scream 3 were toned down was because it was a reaction to the Columbine shooting. The Columbine shootings happened just a year before Scream 3, and somebody mentioned this in the comments to my Scream 3 review, and it kind of enlightened me a bit. I'm like, oh, okay, if that's the reason, that kind of makes a lot of sense. So I can give Scream 3 a pass on that one, but the kills in this knock the kills of Scream 3 out of the park, because they are bloody, they're grotesque. There's a sequence where one of the new characters is murdered by Ghostface. When Sidney goes up to her room, it's all covered in blood, and this character's just lying on the bed with her guts spilling out. That's probably the most grotesque this movie ever gets, because it doesn't reach the same levels of torture porn the way that the Saw movies do, because at the end of the day, Scream is more about the whodunit, and if this movie had gone that route, it would have been incredibly off-putting. So it might be pushing pushing it for some, but it's probably the most horrific these kills have ever been since the first Scream, especially with Drew Barrymore's death. This might actually be the most meta film of the entire Scream franchise, because it opens up with what we assume is the opening of this movie, with 2 girls getting killed, but it ends up being the opening to Stab 6. Then we cut to Kristen Bell and Anna Paquin watching that movie, and then it turns out that's the opening of Stab 7. So they're watching, the characters in Stab 7 are watching the opening of Stab 6. That doesn't make any sense. Remember in Halloween H2O when Scream 2 is playing on the TV, and you think, wait a minute, if that's Scream 2, then Scream 1 exists, which has characters watching the original Halloween on TV, so that's a paradox right there. So yeah, this movie is basically the inception of horror movie openings. It's really weird. And the newer characters are once again horror nerds. They talk about all the rules when it comes to horror remakes, although that notion about if you're gay, you survive a horror movie, I've never seen that cliche work, especially since It Chapter 2 just threw that out the window. Granted, that was almost a full decade after Scream 4 came out, but the point still stands. Now let's talk about the characters. Obviously we've got Sidney, Dewey, and Gale back again, and it's really great to see these characters together. All these actors fit comfortably into these roles. It's refreshing to see that Sidney has kind of moved on from Ghostface. Though she has to deal with this certain scenario, she doesn't let Ghostface psychologically torture her the way she has in the first 3 Screams. Dewey and Gale work really well together as a married couple that is trying to work it out, but they still love each other, which is interesting because at this point in time, both David Arquette and Courteney Cox were separated, and they were a few years off from officially being divorced. It's nice to see this group together again, and to be as active as they are, which is something that Scream 5 didn't really do. Not that I had a problem with Scream 5, because I really enjoyed the new characters in that movie, but it's nice to see that the old characters got a lot to do in this one. Now, what about the new characters of this movie? Well, there's only a few that really stick out. You have the 2 film student characters who pretty much are 2 different versions of Randy from the first 2 Screams. They're relatable to me in the sense that they're full-blown movie nerds, and that's pretty much what they talk about nonstop. Emma Roberts as Jill Roberts, Sidney's cousin, is a lot of fun. Her boyfriend is a blank slate. There's not much to that character. Alison Brie has a really fun role as Sidney's publicist. Basically, she's Gale without really having any consideration for other people. Adam Brody and Anthony Anderson are fun as the 2 cops that Ghostface ends up killing, and Anthony Anderson's death in this movie made me laugh hard. I mean, it's bloody, but the fact that he gets stabbed in the brain and is able to walk past the cop car after getting out is pretty impressive. I thought, that's so ridiculous and unrealistic that I can't help but love it. Only to find out that Wes Craven actually based this death off a real-life incident that he read about. Marley Shelton is the deputy sheriff who works with Dewey, and being somebody who watched Scream 5 before watching the other sequels, she was a character in that movie I thought, she must be pretty relevant for her to be killed off that suddenly. So to see her in this movie, I got a little more context of what this character was like. But the one new character in this movie that everyone remembers, that Scream fans love to talk about, is Hayden Panettiere as Kirby Reed. Every hardcore Scream fan that I know loves Kirby Reed, and they cite her as one of the best new characters of the franchise. Having watched this movie for the first time, I can easily see why. She's very knowledgeable in horror movies. Basically, she's the kind of person, her and Randy, that I wouldn't mind being friends with. More than the 2 characters who are head of the high school's film club, Kirby Reed is probably the closest we'll get to a new Randy. Maybe not as meta, but just enough to where, yeah, this character is super memorable. And watching this movie made me even more excited for her return in Scream 6. So it'll be really great to see her back in this franchise, especially seeing how she'll interact with the new cast, especially Mindy. So I'm thrilled to see Kirby make a return, especially considering that she gets stabbed in the movie, and it's kind of ambiguous on if she survived or not. If I had any real issues with the movie, there's one issue that bugged the hell out of me, but as for minor issues, I wish I'd seen this movie much earlier, because knowing that Hayden Panettiere is going to come back in Scream 6 made her unambiguous fate in this movie less suspenseful. Had I seen this movie earlier, I would have thought that they just killed Kirby right then and there. Also, having watched Scream 5 before this one, it feels like the proto legacy sequel template. Even before movies like Jurassic World, Creed, The Force Awakens, or Spider-Man No Way Home, this movie felt like the very first legacy sequel before there were legacy sequels. Now, the biggest issue I have with this movie, the thing that from the first frame irritated the hell out of me, is whatever filter they used to film this on. Because while I really enjoyed this movie, it is an ugly film to watch. It is just so disgusting and unappealing with whatever camera filter that they used. Was this supposed to be a commentary about how murky a lot of horror remakes can be? Maybe, but if it's bad enough to where I'm distracted throughout, that's not a good sign. Okay, maybe that's pushing it a little too far in terms of a criticism, because while I do think this movie really looks terrible, it's not enough to ruin it, because the writing is still very much on point. The kills are great. I really enjoyed the cast and all these characters. And even though I was spoiled beforehand on who the Ghostface killer of this movie is, when the reveal comes and we see the explanation for why, it kind of checks out, considering when this movie came out and how social media was just starting to blow up. It actually makes a lot of sense for the Ghostface killer to be who it ended up being, and why. So I'd say it's worth seeing in your lifetime. Definitely a big step up from Scream 3, and I think I might like this a little more than Scream 5. It's been a while since I've seen the movie from beginning to end. I mean, a while. It's just a little over a year old. I haven't seen Scream 5 since theaters, but right now I think I might enjoy Scream 4 a little more, but these two can easily go back and forth when it comes to my second favorite Scream movie. And there you go, that's my review for Scream 4 and the entire Scream series. Because last year I did review the 5th Scream when it came out in theaters. It was the first one I ever saw in theaters, and considering I saw it at a point where I only saw the first one, this one was a really great impression on, hey, maybe the other sequels will be good. And aside from Scream 3, they are. I am absolutely excited for Scream 6. I'm a little hesitant considering that Neve Campbell's not coming back, but considering how the last movie was more focused on the new characters and not so much the older characters, I think that it might be appropriate story-wise that Sydney doesn't come back. Plus, I think this woman's deserved a break. She's been fending off Ghostface for 5 movies. It's time that woman just takes a break and goes, you know what? That's your problem. I am not dealing with Ghostface right now. But also, I'm just kind of wondering, what's Scream 6 going to talk about? Because each movie had something they wanted to talk about within the horror franchise or the film industry in general. What's this one going to talk about? So we'll find out the answer next week. But until then, I want to know what you guys think about Scream 4. If you've seen it, what did you think? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell button to get notifications. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. I'll see you guys in the next video, but until then, have a good day and take care of yourselves.